And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this week on Wednesday, the skies over a tiny town in North Dakota were black with smoke and red with flame after a train carrying crude oil derailed and exploded outside the town of Heimdall, North Dakota. It was a large fire involving several tank cars and the evacuation of that tiny town of 27 people. Now, this is not the first time this has happened, and it comes just as the government is looking at new regulations for the transport of crude oil, which was the source of these flames. And joining us now to discuss that is Matt Krogh. He is the director of the U.S. Oil Campaign for Forest Ethics. Matt, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Now, they're calling these kinds of trains, these crude oil transport trains, bomb trains. I'm hearing that term more and more. Why would they call them bomb trains?
Well, you know, it's a term that originated with the railroad engineers who are actually driving the trains, and I think aptly describes the perspective that you have sitting at the front of, let's call it a 100-car train, which would make it about 3 million gallons of very volatile crude. And so this is actually one of the features of the industry, and what's changed in the last 5 years, why you're hearing more and more about this, is that crude has moved by rail for many years. But about 5 years ago is when these bomb trains, maybe 6 years ago, really started going. And what is different is that they are all the same tank car, 100 or more of them in a row, stacked up together in a single train that never breaks apart from, the beginning of its origin to its destination, and it's just a vast volume of what turns out to be highly explosive crude, whether you're talking about the shale oil from the Bakken region or diluted tar sands bitumen from Alberta.
So you're really talking about by connecting them together like that, you don't just have one explosive car, you have a chain reaction, for lack of a better term.
That's exactly right. And so when you look at fire departments' capacities around the country, many of them, or if not most of them, are entirely volunteer. Most don't have the response capacity to deal with even a single truck of crude. And a single truck, a tanker truck, is about a third of a tank car on a train. So when you think about, any fire department in any major city, whether it's Chicago or D.C., any of the places where these trains might run, they can handle a fire of, maybe 10,000 or so gallons of crude. Now, each of these tank cars holds 30,000 gallons of crude, and it's, the stuff coming out of North Dakota has never been treated. It hasn't been degasified, and even if it were, you're talking about containers, strong containers on fire. What we see in these accidents, it's not just a single car comes off. Many cars come off. It was 10 in North Dakota yesterday. We've seen 20, 30 come off, multiple cars. What you end up with are multiple cars filled with explosive crude lying in a pool of burning oil. And that's something that the only response is to evacuate.
Well, now, you mentioned Chicago and D.C., which, of course, are two cities where this program is broadcast, and that's what caught my eye. Are you saying that these bomb trains, as we'll call them, for lack of a better nickname, they go through big cities?
Oh, yeah. It's actually a stunning thing when you start to take a look at it. You would think that with a material as hazardous as this, that the railroads would be making routing decisions that would protect as many people as possible. It turns out that the opposite is true, and one of the things that is very different in this oil by rail industry versus, say, pipelines, is that rail is designed to connect population centers. It is supposed to be bringing goods to population centers, so the best routes, the best maintained routes, like Class 1 rail, is what the railroads want to use. They don't want these derailing either. But so when you get a chance to look at their decisions, they are actively deciding to run trains through population centers because it's the best set of rails.
So if they're doing that, we're talking with Matt Krogh of Forest Ethics about trains carrying crude oil and about the explosion in North Dakota this week. If that's the case, first of all, I know the government is preparing to implement new regulations. How are those regulations going to protect us? Will they protect us? And if not, what would?
Well, you've asked a series of questions there that have a lot of different variables, and I guess the clear answer is the current regulations do virtually nothing to protect us from this particular threat. And I'll give you an example. For example, these regulations specify speed limits of 50 miles per hour maximum around the country, with 40 miles per hour in what they call high-threat urban areas, which is a few dozen cities around the country. However, except for one derailment, all 5 major derailments of oil trains and one ethanol in 2015 happened under 40 miles an hour, and they still ruptured and exploded. Now, that's just the speed limit component. What you would hope is that the speed limit component was actually matched to the new standards for tank cars. So these tank cars, they've been in 1960s, 1970s design. They puncture at 8 miles an hour, the old ones. The new ones that were designed in 2011 puncture at about 9.5 or 10 miles an hour. And these new, this best, highest standard that they're going to be held to has side impact, they call it a puncture velocity, of 12 miles an hour and 18 miles an hour at the ends. Now let's compare that for a second back to that speed limit. The slowest they'll be required to go is 40. So what you have is an agency, in this case it's called the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. It's a subset of the U.S. Department of Transportation, who is taking a look at this very, very dangerous business and choosing to offer up speed limits that are more than twice the puncture velocity of the tank cars they're certifying at the same time. And it's a clear choice in favor of industry profits over public safety.
So how much, and I think that's a great point, we're basically certifying vehicles that will explode at well below their permissible speeds. We're talking about the so-called bomb trains, the trains which carry crude oil. We're talking with Matt Krogh, U.S. Oil Campaign Director for Forest Ethics. Now, okay, so what would protect us if these vehicles are unsafe at any speed as designed? Because let's face it, you're not going to be operating any train at 6 or 9 miles per hour, and you can't protect it from being hit laterally by a car or something else at a higher speed. If they're not protecting us, what would protect us? Obviously, we would need stronger cars, right?
Well, stronger cars at a much higher level would, I think, make it nearly impossible for the industry to profit, which is exactly the point of the regulations as they stand, is to allow them to profit while putting us at risk. And I would say, based on based on work from the National Transportation Safety Board and looking at this, it simply cannot be done both safely and profitably. And the only real answer is to stop this industry. Now, let's think back 5 years ago to ban the oil trains. We don't need them. 5 years ago, we did not have this industry. The world is currently awash in crude. We can acquire it through any number of different methods. We know that out of the Bakken region, people talk about pipelines to solution. Out of the Bakken region of North Dakota, they have 400,000 barrels a day of unused pipeline capacity because they are preferentially choosing to go get bigger profits where they can get rail or oil trains to the coasts, the east and the west in particular. Let
me just stop you for a second. When you say we didn't have this industry, you mean the industry of rail transport of oil?
I do. I mean these large oil trains, because what they've had to do is build new receiving centers where they can offload large volumes of oil from these trains. It's not a simple thing to take 3 million gallons of crude out of a train, over the course of about a day. So when I talk about this industry, we didn't have the ability in any part of this country to receive these unit trains, the 100 cars or more, mile and a half long trains. And so when I say this industry, I'm talking about the oil train industry that relies on unit trains of oil to transport that crude to either a refinery or a transshipping point.
So before we had that, before this new train, black train or bomb train industry arose, then the two other forms of delivery, I would assume, obviously pipelines. We don't want to build new pipelines, but there's some pipelines in place. And I would assume the other way they were transported was by tractor-trailer.
Well, so there's very little truck transport of crude. It's mostly been pipeline, and when you take a look at a map of the U.S. and where our refineries are, for the portion of this that's for domestic consumption. We're really all around the coasts because we've traditionally brought in a lot of crude by tanker from all over the world. Right. And the feature of this particular boom and what they pretend to be American energy independence is if you add up how much we use in the U.S., how much crude, we're talking 19 or 20 million barrels a day. But what they won't tell you is that we're exporting 3.5 to 4.5 million barrels a day of what they call petroleum products, all these different things. And so in the U.S., in the last 10 or so years, we've reduced our oil consumption by over 10%. It's closer to 15%. So as we are reducing our consumption, we're actually increasing how much we are producing and exporting. And so any discussions that are out there about, the Bakken crude, the U.S. production all being about energy independence, it's simply not true. It's about exports and profits.
So what you're saying is that this is strictly, this is not helping our energy independence. This is strictly about driving up profits for the oil companies. It's at the expense of our safety. It's at the expense of our economy with the poisoning that goes on with these explosions and so on. Is that a fair summary?
That's exactly right. And when you take a look at the actual volume of the crude that we process, I'm not going to say consume because, as we pointed out, much of it is for export. The actual volume that's transported by train is about 4 or 5% of what we process. So this is, it's simply not needed. It's a volatile product that is poisoning North Dakota. As you point out, it has that impact during derailments and spills. And it's something that would just be better left in the ground.
So your solution would be shut down the train transport of crude oil, and if that means we have to cut back the production, that won't hurt our country at all.
That's right. And, right now we've got incredible solutions out there. We have an amazing set of standards for cars. Part of the reason we're using less and less oil is because of efficiency standards. We have opportunities for moving into renewables, into different types of transportation. And we really have some great pathways ahead of us to get off of fossil fuels entirely. And many people are working on them right now. And so when we talk about the expansion of the oil industry, when we talk about the extreme oils like the fracked shale oil from the Bakken region or the tar sands from Alberta, and that place is a wasteland. If you've ever seen pictures of the tar sands, you understand what the impact of that extreme oil industry is. We simply don't need to expand the oil industry. In fact, we should be working to contract it as we expand our solution sets.
Well, that's a great summary, and unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But if people want to know more about what you guys are doing, they can go to forestethics.org, right?
Absolutely right, forestethics.org.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us. Matt Krogh is the campaign director of, or the director of their U.S. oil campaign, I should say, for Forest Ethics. Matt, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Same here. And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero